Welcome to Age of AI, Politics, Law, and Society, hosted by Medler Mema, Chris Lamont, and Young Diogenes, in association with the Global Governance Institute in Brussels.
Welcome to Age of AI. Today's guest is Jeremy Tamanini, the founder of Dual Citizen, a New York-based consultancy. Jeremy has been working in the sustainability space for over 10 years, and recently has been working on assignments at the intersection of AI and environmental sustainability, which is also the topic of our conversation today. Jeremy, welcome to Age of AI.
Thank you so much, Medler. It's a pleasure to be here. This is a very timely topic.
Yes, it is.
And I look forward to going through it with you.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And of course, whenever we say that you've been on assignment at the intersection of AI and environmental sustainability, of course, people become curious. I'm curious. What does that mean?
Yeah, what it means is that I've been working for over 10 years using data and data measurement to help clients quantify their sustainability performance. And that's been kind of ongoing, and it's still ongoing. But what happened in the past couple of years is that several clients got really interested in AI, and not just in AI in terms of what can it do for me, how can it add efficiency to my organization, but also what are the costs and implications of integrating AI systems. And one of those implications, as we'll talk about today, has to do with the environmental footprint of these systems and how organizations can understand and measure that.
Before we move, I guess, to this question of environmental standards, just a quick question just on what you're finding as you are talking to various organizations. We've had these conversations before with people that actually are in the consultancy or the advising, the C-suite kind of executives. And there is this hope that AI is a solution, right? That for everything that ails a company. What are you finding as you're going around and visiting with these various companies?
Yeah, my general finding is that most enterprises and organizations are in learning mode right now. In fact, I would almost argue that enterprises, organizations, they're actually a bit behind consumers right now, which is interesting because we think of big companies as being always way ahead of the curve. I think there's a pause going on. I think there's obviously a lot of interest. There's a lot of meeting and considering and testing within different sectors, but it's a big investment. And also remember, it has a lot to do with human capital. A lot of the tech talent and the really deep talent on these topics is being hoarded by big tech firms. So if you're even a Fortune 500 company, you don't necessarily have the capacity internally to do some of the things that you want to do on your own. So that's another issue that I'm noticing a lot within these organizations and companies.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, one of the things that I've heard quite a bit as well is just the idea that there's an expectation, or said that this is a panacea, like this will actually solve problems automatically. But I think you just highlight something very important, this idea that maybe they're not as resource abundant as we probably would have anticipated. This has been a very interesting week in Washington, D.C., and I guess for our listeners, we are going to focus primarily today. You are, as you said, New York-based, you're international, you work everywhere. But today, I just want to focus a little bit more because of the new incoming administration, the Trump administration. There's been a lot of movement in the space of AI. How do you assess the current moment that we're going through?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's 4 days in and it's all over the news. And I do live in the United States. So I don't know. It's so hard to be an American kind of speaking for the administration. But what I'll do is kind of step back a little bit.
Okay.
I want to kind of just situate your listeners in what was happening on Sunday, right? So like Sunday night before the inauguration of Trump's second term, what is the context that he's walking into around these issues of AI and sustainability? And there are 3 points that I think are important to remember pre-Trump. The first point is that globally, we've basically busted through the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold that has structured so much of climate negotiations, so much of corporate targets. This has been this kind of aspirational target that's floated around and talked about constantly and actually structured a lot of target setting. And we're basically past it, or we've permanently past it last year or in 2026, 2025. I don't exactly know, but it's no longer a credible goal. And I say that just because before anything Trump does on all these different areas, that's the reality in our global climate context, if you will. And it's important to remember as we go into the next few years, because I fear and worry how that will have implications for how actors, states or companies, smaller organizations respond to this climate urgency when they don't feel that the global targets are even serious a chance anyway. So that's number one. Number two is a bit different. It has to do more specifically with technology. And it's important to remember that compute refers to the processing power used to do all kinds of actions in the digital space, whether it's like refreshing my Instagram or LinkedIn feed, whether it's creating and posting videos, whether it's doing this podcast, whether it's more advanced AI systems. Compute has never had no environmental impacts, right? So we talk a lot about efficiency in electric vehicles or getting away from fossil fuels. There's certain facets or pockets of our society and economy where we're very conscious of the environmental footprint, but that's never taken hold around compute. So that's been the case for several years now. And I think what's hopeful about this conversation and the huge amount of compute that AI systems gobble up is that maybe it can begin to force that awareness. And then the third point, which we've already talked about briefly, is that AI adoption, particularly, within the broader economy, it's still in its very early stages. For a project last year, we looked at the filings of companies in the United States, startups that were looking to go public that had AI in their name, and actually found that less than 1% of their collective revenue was derived from AI systems. Similarly, if you poll Fortune 500 companies right now and you ask them the amount of material, tangible revenue that's being generated through AI, you get similarly low numbers. So it's important to remember there's a lot of buzz, there's a lot of discussion, but we're still in very early days.
Thank you for that, Jeremy. Just a quick question, though, just to follow up as we're talking about the Trump administration. There were some big announcements that were made in the first days. As you said, it's only the first week of his administration, although it feels like, longer than that, perhaps. And of course, in the last days of the previous administration now, the Biden administration, there were also some big announcements when it came to AI itself. Do you see any common threads there? Do you see any continuity, or do you see mostly disruption again, early days, but from one administration to the other?
That's a great question. I see much more continuity than disruption on this particular issue. I think
where specifically would you say that?
Yeah, so I'll talk about the disruption first. So Trump on Monday, Tuesday, whenever it was, he did repeal an executive order that Biden had made, I believe in 2023, that instructed federal agencies to assess the impacts or future impacts that AI may have on their mandates. These studies, though, have largely been completed. In fact, many of them you can find in the public domain. So, yeah, in typical Trump fashion, he made a big theatrical moment about repealing this Biden executive order, but it doesn't really have much relevance because the studies are already done. So that would be one example, though, of disruption. But to your question, there's been a lot more continuity. So, for example, Biden had designated federal sites that are owned by the Department of Defense or the Department of Energy to be leased for data center development. This is something Biden did just before leaving office. It's something Trump has not touched. In fact, I assure you that a lot of the data center development that happens through this new Stargate initiative that was announced by Trump with Oracle and some other big tech leaders will leverage that designation that Biden made prior to leaving office. Similarly, around continuity, these trade restrictions, Biden had initiated some trade restrictions on sensitive property and advanced chips. I don't see anything changing there. If anything, I would imagine, or I could envision, that those would become more severe, more extreme under Trump as his trade stuff gets going. And lastly, this issue of government having some oversight on foundational models created by a lot of these companies, that hasn't been touched either. And that's a tricky one to decipher, Medlir, because we've never really had visibility as to how that's happening between government agencies and large tech companies, but there's been no mention of that. So more continuity than disruption. Again, wait and see, but I don't want people to get too lost in the flurry of executive orders because they don't always have as much impact and change embedded in them than the rhetoric suggests.
Yeah, I mean, my view and my assessment is very similar to yours. I do want to emphasize one, in terms of disruption, is in terms of personnel, right? My understanding is that just like in other areas of the federal bureaucracy, it seems that Trump is making good, quotation marks, but he's making good on his promise that he is going to go after bloated bureaucracy or whatever. The interesting thing, of course, is that when it comes to, this AI space, there aren't that many, right? Partly because, as you said, qualified personnel is hard to come by, but there's a lot of disruption happening there. And so this is real for young people that work in this space. So I think that's important to point out as well.
And if I may, obviously there's a lot to criticize and scrutinize around the proximity of those tech CEOs, and then obviously to him. But the flip side of that is you wonder the extent to which some of the expertise and the knowledge within the tech sector may infiltrate government agencies as well. So, yeah, but it's a dynamic for sure.
Yeah, no, certainly. And I've seen a lot of activity in DC and elsewhere from various companies, mostly tech-based, as you point out, that are trying now to leverage that proximity with Trump. As you said, ultimately, that may affect policy. And so if that means that we're a bit more aware, maybe we can build into governance models, these kinds of considerations, that's important. But I mean, you said something earlier that kind of highlights a bit my dilemma, and I think our dilemma on this issue. You said even this conversation, in a way, right? It's a form of compute, and it's all rather running on compute. And which means that as we speak, we're having an impact on climate and sustainability questions. Just having with colleagues talking about the impact of AI in education, and there's always talk about how we can use that to shortcut certain processes and how we can, train students, but at the same time, I can even shorten the time that it's required for us to prepare, right, or to grade or to do whatever. And yet we have not spoken at all about the impact, right, that any of these kind of technologies have on the environment. So I was actually reading just recently this report on the environmental impact of full AI life cycle and the need to comprehensively assess that. And just four points, if you just stay with me, because I want you to respond to those 4 particular points. We hear these various arguments at different times, but never all in one. And I thought that this particular report was an important one. We'll put links to the report or show notes. But the first kind of in the life cycle, or the full AI life cycle, the first environmental impact is the fact that electronics that are used in, again, technology, whether you're making a PC or training data, houses, rely on a staggering amount of grist. So to make a 4-pound, I'm going to do this for American audiences, a 4-pound computer, it's required about 1,600 pounds of raw material. Mm-hmm. And when you add to that microchips that power, let's say, AI, you need rare earth minerals and elements. These are often mined in environmentally destructive ways. Again, This is just quoted from the report. The second problem cited here is that data centers produce electronic waste, which often then again contains hazardous waste like mercury and lead. And then third, data centers use water during construction. And then once operational, you use it again to cool down electrical components. And so I've heard here comparisons, for AI-related infrastructure that may consume more than Netherlands or Denmark, right? I think one data here used by this report was 6 times more water than Denmark, a country of 6 million people. So now, can we consider how difficult access to water is for the rest of humanity? That's one of our essential kind of problems and concerns, that is an issue. And then finally, of course, to power these complex electronics, data centers and others that host AI technology, you need a lot of energy, which, of course, it comes from burning fossil fuel and other types of emitting and greenhouse gases that, in turn, warm the planet. So we have at least 4 distinct, and I imagine that these kind of are repeated in half cycles in between. It's not just stuck in these very discrete cycles. There's overlapping kind of impacts. Help us make sense of this and help us understand, in what world does it make sense then for us to go just, headlong into this AI revolution when we consider the environmental impact?
Well, first of all, thank you, Madlir, because I think those 4 pillars are so important for your listeners to understand, because they really are critical. They're central to this new economy that's ballooning around us. And I'd like to get into each one of them, because I think each one is equally important. Before I do that, though, I just want to address what you segued into this with compute and what we all use, and just make a couple call outs for your listeners. So around this issue of compute, I met someone named Elisa Bonsignor, who I met at something called the National Sustainability Society last year, and she just published a book called Sustainable Content: How to Measure and Mitigate the Carbon Footprint of Digital Data. And her whole initiative and book is about not solving, necessarily the macro issues that we're talking about, but more just working with organizations to help optimize on a micro level how they put out content, how they work internally. So that's one resource that I would point your listeners to. The second resource is it's something called The Anatomy of an AI System. And it was done several years ago by 2 academics who looked at the Amazon Echo, and they actually mapped visually the entire life cycle of an Amazon Echo, not just in terms of materials, but also in terms of labor, obviously energy and water use, the afterlife, if you will, after it's used through a typical life cycle with the consumer. So that's another really interesting resource for your listeners to look at, I think, to understand this life cycle approach. So, but getting into the 4 pillars that you brought up, more specifically, let's see, how do I look at these things? I mean, I think it's a big question, but I think that the first part of it is to just acknowledge and to really internalize that our green economy, that we hope is more electrified, that we hope runs more on renewable energy, that we hope is much more efficient around natural resources like water, still will be resource intensive to some extent. Now, if you want kind of some estimates, and I was looking before the meeting, but there's some new estimates around the amount of cobalt, the amount of nickel, the amount of these minerals that are going to be required just for batteries. And the numbers are sort of like same kind of thing you're seeing with electricity use around AI systems. So the first answer to the question, I think, is to understand that this is part of this new economy. It's unavoidable, but to think about circularity as one example. So to think about as we develop and transition, it's not just about transitioning from one thing to another. It's also about imagining how the next thing can be designed, produced, and scaled in a way that's more circular, that relies more on recycling, that has more efficiency embedded in it. So that's again, it's like a double think. I think there's almost this misconception that we think, oh, well, if we switch to electric vehicles or if we switch to renewable energy,
Right.
how our need for the materials that build them will go away. That's not true. We're still going to have to get them from somewhere. So that's kind of point number one around the materials themselves. And I think it relates to the waste question as well. If you look at waste, most of the waste, which tends to be in the form of mercury, lead, etc., that is associated with these data centers happens when the internal elements are decommissioned, which often can happen every 2 to 5 years. So again, to the point of circularity and lifespan, there's something important in terms of product design for the future to build more resiliency and more of a lifespan to the elements of these data centers as a way of limiting some of the waste production that you mentioned, which is obviously a big problem now. And by the way, it's a big problem on the communities that are located near these data centers, because there's a social dimension here as well in terms of site location. Where are data centers being built? Where are some of the negative impacts in local water systems being felt in terms of these byproducts of the data centers, not to mention, as you said, the water use itself? Just talking about the United States, without even getting into parts of the global south, where, by the way, there's been social unrest, Chile and India, where communities have stood up and they've said, you know what, we don't want this data center. We're not buying this line about how there are these big economic benefits and job possibilities. We need our water. We need to preserve our natural resources and land for our own preservation. So there's a tension there for sure that's, I think, only more and more going to come to a head. On water and energy, I mean, these are the pieces that have gotten the biggest attention so far, I think.
Right.
And one thing that I think's really helping this to break through is exactly what you led with, Medlir, which is this idea of one data center consumes, and you sort of give the comparison, the same amount as, the city of Pittsburgh, or whatever the comparison is. I think those are great. I think they're great communication tools. And I think we really have academics to thank for that, because there's been zero transparency from the big tech companies in the past few years around what type of electricity and water impact these data centers are having. The only viewpoint that we have into this is coming from very intrepid, creative academics who basically have looked at, the number of GPUs that are associated with a given data center. And then they've done all kinds of extrapolations, coming up with estimates of what kind of electricity and water impact that these systems have had. So that's great. And I hope that that continues. But I think that the communication piece is something that I definitely feel is breaking through, and looking at it in this comparative way where we're very clearly, it means a lot when you say the country of Denmark, the country,
another times the country of Denmark, water consumption.
Today, today, that breaks through. That's an aha moment for people.
Yeah. And I think part of the reason why a lot of these companies don't want to talk about it is because of what you just pointed out, but also because clearly they're yet to monetize, right? A lot of this. So a lot of people have questioned the financial sustainability. And it seems like they just need to raise even more and more money. While we're on this topic, there's been a lot of talk when it comes to energy sources for nuclear as a solution. We know that, I think it was Microsoft that is trying to revive the 3 Mile Island. I think Mark Zuckerberg went to the White House during the Biden administration asking for his own, nuclear reactor, which is mind-boggling when you think about that, right? I mean, if there is something that drives home not just the environmental impact, but how energy intensive and resource intensive the training and everything else around it is, that's it, right? Every company now needs a nuclear reactor. Do you see nuclear as a way out of this energy crunch? If we're just thinking about the energy part of it. And nuclear, by the way, doesn't come energy free either, right? You also need resources, material, water, and everything else that you would normally need for the training part. So it's not like it just solves and all the other problems disappear. But at least on the energy side, some argue that that's one solution at least.
Yeah, it's interesting. It sort of goes back to what we started with. This is nothing new, right? So nuclear has always been the big question mark in the sustainability discourse. It is low carbon in the sense that the emissions associated with nuclear energy are much less. However, there are environmental risks. There are risks to the community. So it's never quite been resolved, sort of more broadly speaking. And I think we're going to see the same thing with the tech companies increasingly leaning on nuclear, probably mostly because it allows them access to sources of energy, but at the same time, not massive increases in their emissions portfolio, which allow them to keep somewhat aligned with some of the targets that they've made. What I hope for, which doesn't really have to do with nuclear, I mean, back in the late 2010s, many tech companies were real pioneers at establishing these power purchase agreements with large renewable energy providers. And actually, we have the tech sector to credit in some ways in the United States for the scaling of a lot of these renewable sources through power purchase agreements, which again, it was for their self-interest. They needed to secure energy supply for growing data centers, but in doing it, they gave solar, wind, etc., a bit of a boost. So we can hope maybe that as part of this rapid scaling in the 2020s around these data centers, that there will be also a lot of additional renewable capacity that'll be brought on, in addition to certainly nuclear and unfortunately natural gas as well to some extent. What disappoints me, and this is where I think there does seem to be a real disruption between Biden and Trump, and there's nothing new here, but, you know, the Trump administration just seems so allergic to the free market reality today around the competitiveness of renewables. I mean, it's mind-boggling to me that the Republican Party, which for so long has preached, you know, free market principles, with fossil fuels, it's like they completely become a whole other mindset and become obsessive around protecting this particular facet of the economy. So again, remains to be seen if there could be a market momentum that develops around building renewable capacity for these data centers that might outrun whatever efforts the administration might put in action to inhibit them. So we'll see. But right now, it just feels kind of like a mixed bag. And in terms of your question with nuclear, I'm somewhat agnostic. I like the idea that it is lower, it has a lower emission impact. And I think that's pretty good. And that's probably going to just have to be realistically part of the mix.
Okay. Well, just one last question from me, I suppose, just in terms of where we go from here. I mean, we've kind of laid out a little bit the moment we're going through and kind of the environmental impact the AI is having. But let's look at some, I guess, good news. I don't know, solutions. I know there's been some movement in Congress. It is the last Congress, so we have to start over again, of course, but both in the Senate and the House. There was one, I think, by Senator Markey and Heinrich, that's called the AI Environmental Impacts Act of 2024. This was, I think, co-sponsored by, again, it was also introduced in the House by Representative Issue and Beyer. But there have been, I think there were over 100 bills that were introduced in Congress. So it's not that Congress has not been quiet on this, but obviously they haven't made much of a headway. I'm not sure with the current administration they'll do a whole lot. But if we put that aside, you know, what are we looking for in terms of policy and regulation so that we may end up with sustainable AI development?
Right. That's a great question. In terms of the Congress, I'd say in Europe, it's a different conversation. But in the United States, I am not going to be counting on this Congress to do anything along the lines of the AI Environmental Impacts Act, which, to describe it, was introducing requirements that would require transparency and reporting on the environmental impacts we're talking about from development of a lot of these foundational models. That I don't see that happening in the next couple of years. I do think around, AI safety, around some of these kind of, Trump himself in 2020 introduced something around sort of, broad language about AI should be developed for the good of humanity, things like that. I think we'll see some of that. I think we'll see a very delicate dance going on between this tech sort of contingent that is hovering and the new administration. And it will have to wait and see how much of that results in the administration rolling over to the tech sector's desires versus how much of it might lead to smart, impactful, productive regulation or safeguards being put into place on the government side. So that's kind of the answer I'd give around the regulatory dimension. In terms of kind of like me or you or like citizens, academics, people I work with and I'm close with around sustainability and progress in this area. And I know that everyone's at a real moment of pause right now, and there's a real pause and reflection and reassessment and rethink around what the way forward is with this new administration. And more broadly, what I started with, this reality around the Paris Agreement, around the 1.5 degree threshold. And there are a few points I want to make just in conclusion that I think are worth considering around this rethink. The first has to do just with what we're doing now. I think so much of what's important this year is just about awareness. So getting this topic out into the media, on podcasts, just getting the language embedded in the media that these systems have an environmental footprint. There are sort of implications of using them, of scaling them, of making them more complicated. And then also this idea of mainstreaming that within organizations. So busting through this conventional wisdom that bigger is better, helping organizations understand exactly where these AI systems can actually add value, and then helping them along to integrate them in a way that has a lower footprint, that is more efficient. So it's a bit fuzzy, but I think that learning and mainstreaming is still important right now. The second thing is there's an organization called Hugging Face that does excellent work in this space. And they're actually rolling out at the AI Impact Summit, which is in Paris next month, hosted by the French government, something called the AI Energy Score rating system. And I love this, being someone that's worked in data around sustainability, because what they're doing through this system is actually rating different AI systems according to the associated environmental footprint. So I love that type of thing because I think it will start to really make concrete these impacts and make it sort of easier for stakeholders to see. The third thing that's interesting is, shareholder pressure. Like a lot of these shareholder resolutions in the United States around climate disclosures have actually had a lot of impact. So you do wonder, particularly with the big tech companies, particularly with some of these activist shareholders, if they will take this issue on, if they'll start to really pressure more transparency, if they'll shine a light on the AI impact piece that will obviously become a bigger piece of the pie in the next few years. And the same can be said for communities, right? Like community opposition, whether it's to data centers or whether it's just people like organizing and speaking up on a local level, it does matter. It can break through. It can really start to build awareness and change how people talk about these things. And lastly, in the United States, what's so interesting, and I think it's going to be a hallmark of the new Trump administration, is this tension between the federal and the state. That's right. So you're absolutely going to see that in terms of like the vision of executive power that Trump has and how that butts up against the courts and the legal system. But you're also going to see states doing their own things. States do their own things already around climate disclosure, around renewable energy mandates. That's going to continue. They're going to do their own thing around AI. They're going to do their own thing around potentially what you're asking about, the environmental impacts of AI. California, for example, now is the only state, I believe, in the United States that has a climate disclosure mandate that includes scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Any company that has a certain amount of business, I can't remember the threshold in the state of California, is required to have this reporting, I think, by January 2026. California is a really big state. So if dynamics like that continue in states like California or New York, you may start to see an effect where even if the federal government or maybe in the Congress, as we talked about, aren't leading on this, that there's action on the state level that starts to scale and trickle up. So that's another last dynamic that I think is worth focusing on in the coming years.
Well, that's fantastic. I think that's a space that we need to continue looking into. And I think we'll have to have you back again. There's just so much more that I want to talk about, but I think that's probably enough for today. Jeremy, thank you so much for taking some time to be with us. This is a very important and timely subject. Of course, for our listeners, that's it for that show. Thank you for joining us, and join us again next time for another discussion at the intersection of law, society, and politics. Until then, stay human.